Okay, and go for it, Bob. I'm going to come down and find you.
All right. Well, what you see here is a cistern or bathing pool, which it's been repaved, and so it's not in as pristine condition as it was even 10 or 15 years back. They've been doing some shoring up work, so it doesn't look exactly the same. But here is where they saw a crack in the steps of the cistern or the bathing pool. Now, that crack in the steps of the cistern and the bathing pool, even though there was no indication of any other cracks anywhere else particularly, led DeVoe and his team, because, wishful thinking is a wonderful thing, to run with this idea that there had been an earthquake at Qumran that had destroyed the building, and that accounted for why the building was relatively uninhabited in the Herodian period. Now, this is sort of like saying Salome danced on the tabletop, and this accounted for why Herod the Tetrarch decided to execute John. He didn't want to, but his mind was turned. This is their explanation for the relative abandonment of Qumran in the time Herod was king under Roman sponsorship, from the time he stormed the temple in 37 BC to the time he died in 4 BC. Well, look here. How do we know there was a relative diminution in the habitation of Qumran? This is done through coin data. That is, the number of coins that are found, the dates on the coins, what are dropped here, what were found in the excavations. DeVoe did all the work here, and no one really has ever seen all of DeVoe's coins, and many are lost. But the point was, there certainly was a trend. If people are interested in my book, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, in the collection, The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, I give all of the numbers for the coins at different periods. But there certainly is a high point, a relative high point, in the middle of the Maccabean period, which is around the time that this may have been functioning and founded. The coins then trail off to about 40 BC in the Herodian period. Then there's only about 1 or 2 until about 4 BC or 7 AD when they start picking up again, and they reach a high point at the time of the war against Rome from 66 to 68. Now, 68 is going to be an important number because it's a big argument about when this settlement or installation or fortification was abandoned. But the earthquake hypothesis, as it was called, comes from a notice in Josephus that in 31 BC there was an earthquake in the region. And that was taken as gospel for the reason that the peoples may have abandoned this area because it was destroyed. Now, Father DeVoe's assistant, Father Millick, found lots of burning and other sorts of things, burning dish shelves, burned pottery, a layer of destruction around this time too that was in very intense devastation that had occurred at that time. We came along, led by me in the middle 80s, and questioned the earthquake hypothesis. We said, look, if the people came back, and their hypothesis was that they came back in 4 BC or 7 AD, and it was a different movement then. By that time, it was more zealot movement, which is why you get the zealot strains in the literature at that time. That's the zealot hypothesis of Roth and Driver. Others just said they came back after they rebuilt after 4 BC to 7 AD. We said, if they could have come back in 4 to 7 AD, why didn't they come back in 30 AD? Why didn't they come back in 29 AD? Why didn't they come back in 28 AD, in 27 AD? Surely they weren't so frightened. We live in California, I do. An earthquake doesn't frighten us all into the far hill ranges. People come back and they rebuild. But in addition, on the whole, these installations are not living installations. They are, in fact, communal installations. Mostly the people lived either in tents or lean-tos here on the plateau or up in the caves. There's a lot of indication of life in the caves, combs, pottery, different things like that shows they used the caves for both habitation and storage, and they also lived here outside these communal buildings, which included perhaps a dining hall because dishes were found and things of that kind. So the question, was let out. Why didn't they come back earlier? And the answer that we gave, there were political reasons. Now, to understand the political reasons, you had to see this group as not anti-Maccabean, which was the consensus theory, the Essene theory, the theory that you hear from almost all scholars, except for a few mavericks, but that they were anti-Herodian. Well, if you look in their documents, the things they say that would have upset Herod, if you see Herod as a kind of Saddam Hussein, then you'll see that they said enough anti-Herodian things, vis-a-vis Herodian marital practices, not sleeping with women in their periods, not multiplying wives, not being involved in polygamy, all things we know that Herod did, not marrying foreign wives, all things we know that Herod did, not marrying nieces, all things we know that Herod did, etc., and have no indication that the Maccabees, who were relatively pure-minded and the epitome in the first place of the Zealot movement, when the Maccabee books speak of Judas Maccabee's father, they speak of the zeal of Phineas as entitling him and his progeny to occupy the priesthood in perpetuity, and it's based on the fact of Phineas killing backsliders in the camp in the wilderness when they were marrying non-Jews. So the Maccabees were the most zealous and extreme priesthood you can imagine. Here are another group of extreme zealots. In what way could they be against the Maccabeans? But against the Herodians? That's something else. Now, the New Testament is portraying the Herodian priesthood, who are a relatively unacknowledged, illegitimate, collaborating priesthood. And so our theory has always been that the scrolls are misdated, that they're basically out by 100 years or so, and including the internal evidence, the dating going only on the external evidence of paleography and some of the archaeology of Father DeVoe, of which we're seeing here. So we said there were political factors. What were the political factors? Herod had a summer palace not 5 kilometers down the road here. He would not have tolerated a group like this disapproving his sexual and marital matters being anywhere near his summer palace. These people would have been cleared out the same way Saddam Hussein cleared out people. So, to check this, we did a radar ground scan back in 1992. That was one of our objects, to see if there's any indication of an earthquake fault line running through here. We did the whole scan from up there. I can't give you the precise details. It's in some of the articles that we have written. It's since been verified by other people who have come and done radar ground scans. From up there all the way down here in all of these loci. And what we found was that this crack here was part of a local displacement of the land that had a kind of semicircular pattern, the land giving way somewhat, but there was no indication of an earthquake fault line whatsoever at Qumran, nor that an earthquake had ever occurred at Qumran. So in our view, the earthquake hypothesis was another one you hear talked about all of the time, but which is a priori wrong, and in fact, influenced a lot of the dating and the considerations of what Qumran was and when it began and when it was flourishing. It is based on misconceptions about the orientation of what the Dead Sea Scroll Covenanters was all about, and it is finally the weakest point in the Essene theory. I think, there was one point I missed, if I could, just let me think about it now. You can cut it and splice or do what you want. You don't want to keep it, throw it away. Another, I don't mean to overdo the weaknesses of this theory, but another thing that no one ever thought about in terms of the so-called earthquake hypothesis, just because they saw a notice in Josephus that there was an earthquake in 31 BC, and then said, oh, well, this is what caused this particular crack here along this stairway with no indication anywhere else. If in fact it was an earthquake that caused this, which we through the ground scan have subsequently proved that it wasn't, but even if it wasn't, even if it was, well, that earthquake could have occurred in 100 AD, 500 AD, 1000 AD, 1500 AD. We don't know when such an earthquake might have caused this kind of damage. That's the kind of childish, superficial, I call it dumbbell archaeology, the kind of really unsophisticated historical thinking and archaeological theorizing that we've had surrounding the whole subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls, mostly put in place by people who had an agenda or a previous connection, people who were under authority of some kind. On the Christian side, people who were under authority of various churches and religious movement. On the Jewish side, people who were totally focused on the subject of rabbinic Judaism, not understanding that this group was totally opposed to rabbinic Judaism too. And so all of the groups that were doing the theorizing and still doing the theorizing relating to Dead Sea Scrolls studies come from mindsets and authorities, most of them feeling they're under that authority. For instance, Milik says, the righteous teacher at Qumran would be just like our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, but there's no developed doctrine of the supernatural Christ. Well, that shows that he's preconceived, expecting there to be a picture of Jesus like in the Gospels. His mindset is under authority. So, since the archaeology was done by those, since the theorizing was done by those people, they just don't do the detailed scientific consideration that we expect in most other subjects. The Dead Sea Scrolls is an extremely odd subject, peopled by people with extremely deep religious affiliations and mindsets, and the work they've done to some extent is vitiated because of that.
That was a very good point. Very good.
Didn't say it well, but maybe you'll get it out of me better some other time. It's hard to get your brain around it, you know. Okay. This relates to the actual coin data beyond when the earthquake was, the second stage of habitation, as most people put it, that led up to a crescendo in 68 AD at the time of the uprising against Rome. Everyone knows the uprising against Rome. We have Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, to document it, occurred between 66 and 70 AD. 68 to 70 really was what might call its Jacobin phase, when it went into its extreme phase, when all the revolutionaries killed all the high priests and burned their palaces and took over in a kind of semi-democratic zealot phase. I call it the Jacobin phase because I think that's the Jamesian phase anyway. I think these people in the Psalm 37 Pesher, it's shown that these people take vengeance for the death of the righteous teacher on the priest class. And so the Jews are not united in any way at all. But the consensus normative network of scroll scholars, we call it the consensus network, the Essene theory people, like to think that Qumran was abandoned in 68 before the temple fell. And they use coin data to prove that, saying that 68 is the last coin that they have found in this area that they can mark. Well, 68 was the beginning of the time Jerusalem would have been surrounded. So very few coins would have been getting out of Jerusalem anyway, with a mint date later than that. But finding a coin at a certain place is only a terminus a quo. It only tells you from what point the coin could have been dropped. In other words, the coin couldn't have been dropped any earlier than 68. It doesn't say that it was picked up in 68. It doesn't say it was actually dropped in 68. That's just the earliest date. Could have been 70. In other areas now, we found down here at Enfeshka, an agricultural area connected to this settlement, coins from 69. Up by this lookout that's about 4 kilometers down the road that's certainly connected to this location, we found coins from 69 and 70. So, in fact, we don't even yet have all of DeVoe's coins. So just on the basis of coin data, we can't say that Qumran fell in 68. Why is it so important to the theorists? Because the Essene theorists say, aha, we've got you. One of the documents in the scrolls, the Habakkuk commentary, refers to the fall of the temple. Therefore, it couldn't have been the fall of the temple in 70 AD. It must have been the fall of the temple in an earlier time. 37 BC when Herod stormed the temple, 63 BC when Pompey stormed the temple, or even in the Judas Maccabee period. But this, again, is getting very complex. But the point is, it's a non sequitur once again. Because even if it was 68, people like Josephus knew that the temple was doomed. But then once again, even if they abandoned the buildings here in 68, it doesn't mean that they abandoned the site. They were living in caves and lean-tos. The earthquakes, burned buildings would have had no effect on their being in this site and their presence here. In fact, the only real terminus a quo, terminus to which, that you can actually speak of in these terminus ad quem, that you can actually speak about is the Bar Kokhba uprising. We have Bar Kokhba coins from 132 to 136 on this site. The only date that you can really be sure that the scrolls were deposited in the caves. Abandonment of the buildings here does not mean abandonment of the total area. Destruction of the buildings here, even if it was 68, does not mean abandonment of the total area. The only time the total area was finally abandoned was 136 AD. These scrolls could have been put into the caves in 68, in 69, in 70, any time up to when Masada fell in 73. In fact, any time up till 136. Finally, the reference to the fall of the temple is a very important one. It's in the Habakkuk commentary. We'll talk about it. And in the Habakkuk commentary, it says that the Romans and the collaborators with the Romans took the booty from the temple. Well, here we have a very important notification, because in Josephus, going back to the time of Pompey in 63, Josephus specifically notes that Pompey did not want to offend the people and took no booty. In 37 BC, when Herod, backed by another Roman army, stormed the temple with the help of the Pharisees, Josephus specifically noted that Herod did not permit his soldiers to take any booty because he didn't want to antagonize the population. Rather, he paid the soldiers out of his own pockets. The only time booty was taken from the temple was in 70 AD. 70 AD under Vespasian and Titus. That we know for sure. They also probably got the secrets of the copper scroll. And you know what they did with that booty? They took it to Rome for victory celebrations, fun and games in stadiums, celebrations of birthdays, killing prisoners in all kinds of horrible ways with animals and so on. And finally, with the money from the temple, they built the Colosseum. Nothing, it was Vespasian and Titus who built the Colosseum. Nothing could be more ironic than that. From the beautiful Jewish holy site was produced this ogre monster of death that we still all celebrate and go and visit and worship, called the Colosseum. We film movies about the gladiator there, but it was built on blood money, real blood money, not Judas Iscariot's blood money, but blood money from the temple. Nothing is more disconcerting than that. Okay, well, here you see we're entering the graveyard, which is strung out before you here. There's about 1,000 graves here, all laid out in fairly good rows. Thousands is an interesting term for the Bible, but if you look closely at these graves, here's one to my left here. This is oriented, that's north, that's south. Normally speaking, we would not expect a Jewish grave or even a Muslim grave to be oriented in this direction. I have an explanation why these graves are oriented like this, and I'll tell you that in a moment, but you see they're all north and south. Occasionally, you come to an east-west grave, and it's been theorized that those are Bedouin graves that have been put into this graveyard later on. But we mapped this graveyard, University of Hartford, the University of Bar-Ilan, Magen Broshi's group, Hanan Eshel's group, and students from California State University Long Beach under my direction. Philip Reeder from the University of South Florida was directing that group. They mapped this graveyard over the last 3 years, so we now have a digital map of this graveyard and all the graves in it laid out for people. I think it's online. So now we want to walk down to what we consider to be the most phenomenal thing found in recent times in this graveyard, and then we'll talk about the north-south orientations of the majority of the graves. These graves, too, have been pillaged by grave robbers and antiquities hunters And so anything you say about a grave, or if you say grave is important, a couple of weeks later, the materials are gone. There's another problem in dealing with these graves. The rabbinic authorities are very sensitive about Jewish burials. They don't like people disturbing them for obvious reasons, and they consider these mostly to be Jewish burials. And therefore, they get very, very excited if they feel people are incurring in the graves in some way, digging in the graves, or doing anything in the graves that is improper. And frankly, I sympathize with them completely. Here's a good north-south. Here's a good north-south grave here. Here's another one there. These are in rows. Here's another one here. They're just piles of rocks, as you can see, and not too far down is the body. In the early days of Qumran studies, there were some, in the DeVoe period, there were some different people who were criticized for digging up some of these graves. Some of these graves are now in Berlin, some of these bodies in Amman, I think, and some other places. They dug up around 15 or 20, I don't know what the actual numbers are. There have been studies done on the DNA and things, but I'm not au courant about that. The body is laid in the grave. The head faces towards the rising sun. The head is at this end, and I think the reason for that is so when they stand up, they look to the north. Normally, when a Jewish grave of the more modern rabbinic kind stands up, it stands up like that, looking towards the temple. And I think when you have a Muslim grave, it stands up like that, looking towards Mecca. Now, there's going to be a curious thing. Why are these people, if they're Jews, standing up looking towards the north? I think it relates to the bathing groups that I told you about. I think you'll find that all the bathing groups, this swath of area, from the 1st century BC even, or AD, on into the 3rd and 4th century AD, across the Fertile Crescent of northern Syria, you'll find in other areas around the Dead Sea that these El-Khazite, what the Muslims call Sabans, taken from the word Subba, daily immerser. The Muslims in the Qumran consider the Sabans, in Aramaic the Mazbutans, Saba'a being the root relating to bathing. They think of them as people from Sheba in the south because they didn't know their history and they mistook all of these things. And they protected 3 groups, Jews, Christians, and Sabans. But you see, Muhammad wasn't protecting Sabans in an ancient pagan religion from Yemen and southern Arabia. What he was encountering here in Syria and what the Muslim armies encountered here in Palestine and Syria were bathers, Subba, Mazbutans, and even the Muslims misunderstand this. They think of them as stargazers. These people were the Sabans, or the Al-Khazites, and they were ritual bathers of the middle way between Jews and Christians. That's why they are protected peoples. That's why for the Muslims there are 3 protected peoples, Jews, Christians, and Sabans. The 3rd group are the daily bathers who claim to be following John the Baptist. We'll talk more about that again.
Okay, here we go. Go for it.
See, I wanted to do this when they weren't here. Okay, well, as you see, this is the graveyard, and we have our north-south graves running along where you see them. And then right over here on my left is a huge promontory of a very spectacular kind, which actually overlooks the whole north-south situation of the graveyard. And one wouldn't have expected it at the beginning, but you have a beautiful view of the road south, a beautiful view of the road north, but it's the high point of the graveyard. No one ever expected that there would be any graves in that promontory there. One thought of it, one knew there was some construction there, but DeVoe had found it, but one thought of it as basically a lookout post, not something ceremonial or important to the graveyard, because people didn't have an idea of how the graveyard was laid out at that time. But if you see it properly now, there are graves leading right up to it, and certainly as the graves lead right up to it, they're probably more and more important. In fact, one of the holes there is what some of our students found 2 years ago, known as a zinc coffin. This turned out to be a very costly coffin that had clearly, by the metallurgy work done on it, been shipped from Asia Minor. So someone extremely rich wanted to be buried here under the shadow of whatever the personage was that was buried on the top. That coffin has since been taken out, and you can see the big hole, but my daughter-in-law Sarah, and some of my other students, Hanan, my son, Dennis Walker, Ron DeBay, Noel Bautista, all worked on that. And then Dennis Walker went up higher. One of my students who was here two years ago, and he thought with Hanan Eschel's agreement and encouragement that there may be some reason to dig in that mound there. And so he did that. And we'll go over and see the results of it, if I'm not spied on too much by our friends down there, which looks like I'm going to be. Can we do this another day out there?
Sure, absolutely.
Do you mind?
No, that's okay.
I'd rather just walk away from it and not look like I'm, you know. Is that all right? I mean, we can pick up here. Would you please? Okay. Right.
You go ahead.
All right.